A woman appears before the cameras with visible tears, a broken voice, and a speech that appeals to personal pain. She speaks of misunderstanding, of unfair attacks, and of suffering that, according to her words, has placed her at the center of a media storm she never sought. At the same time, far from the spotlights and the public stage, a young actor lies in silence without the possibility of defending himself or explaining what happened in the last hours of his life. Between these two deeply opposing images, public opinion begins to formulate a disturbing question. When a tragedy shakes the world of entertainment, who really controls the narrative of the truth? The death of Yu Menglong was officially catalogued as an accident. However, from the very first moment, that conclusion proved insufficient for a significant part of society. It was not solely about the emotional impact of the loss of a young and promising actor, but about the accumulation of details that did not fit with a simple explanation. The location of the event, the people present that night, and the speed with which the case was closed generated a collective sensation of an informational void, a space where doubt began to grow without control. In that context, the name of Tian Hairong began to emerge with force in the public debate. Her figure, known for years for her artistic and business facets, came to be observed from another angle. For some, she was a woman unjustly dragged into a scandal that did not belong to her. For others, her position and her connections represented the symbol of a system where power and money can alter the perception of facts. This duality turned each of her public appearances into an element of controversy, where even her weeping was interpreted not as an expression of pain, but as part of a carefully constructed narrative. The social reaction was immediate and forceful. Comments of indignation, calls for boycotts, and growing mistrust toward official versions flooded digital platforms. What in other circumstances would have been just another episode of media crisis, in this case, transformed into a deeper debate about the unwritten rules of the entertainment industry. When a work disappears silently from movie theaters and certain documents appear and vanish with the same speed, the perception of transparency weakens, feeding the idea that invisible mechanisms exist operating far from public scrutiny. But behind the public tears and official declarations, what real mechanisms operate when money and power come into play? This story is not limited to a tragic passing, nor to a personal controversy. It is the reflection of a system where silence can become a strategic resource, and where the truth, instead of emerging with clarity, seems to dilute itself among influences and pressures that are difficult to trace. Throughout this analysis, we will examine the documented facts, the most evident contradictions, and the voids that surround the case of Yu Menglong, not with the intention of dictating definitive sentences, but to understand how the machinery of the spectacle really functions when a crisis threatens to expose its darkest zones. Because on occasions, the most relevant question is not what exactly happened, but why the truth remains so elusive when it is needed most. The night Yu Menglong lost his life was officially recorded as a fortuitous episode, an accidental fall from the window of a high-end apartment. However, from the first moment, that scenario awakened a sense of strangeness difficult to ignore. The place was not his habitual residence, and the circumstances surrounding his presence there were never explained with clarity. That evening was not just any private encounter, but a gathering in which several figures linked to the entertainment sector participated, people accustomed to moving in spaces where public visibility and extreme discretion coexist permanently. According to the information that began to circulate in the hours following, Yu Menglong had attended a party where actors, directors, and known business people from the industry were present. The official version maintained that there was no prior conflict and that the outcome was the product of an unforeseeable accident. Nevertheless, for a significant part of public opinion, the speed with which this conclusion was established contrasted with the complexity of the environment and with the absence of detailed explanations regarding what occurred during the critical moments prior to the fall. The first reactions of those who were pointed out as attendees at the meeting arrived with unusual speed. Brief communiques, categorical denials, and temporal clarifications followed one another on social networks as if every word were carefully measured. In that context, some statements drew special attention due to their emphasis on marking distances. It was insisted that certain persons were not at the scene of the events or that they were in other cities for work reasons. These affirmations, far from dispelling doubts, contributed to the public beginning to reconstruct the timeline in a parallel manner, looking for inconsistencies and voids. The name of Tian Hairong emerged with force in this process. Her reaction was immediate and public. She affirmed not having known Yu Menglong in life and expressed that being linked to the case had caused her considerable psychological damage. From a strictly declarative perspective, her words seemed directed at closing any possibility of association. However, the context in which they were produced and the position she occupied within the industry meant that those declarations were subjected to much more severe scrutiny than usual. To understand why her figure became a focal point, it is necessary to observe the environment in which power moves within the entertainment world. It is not solely about artistic talent or commercial success, but about networks of influence built over decades, where personal and professional relationships are intertwined with large-scale economic interests. In that scenario, any crisis acquires a different dimension because it threatens not only individual reputations but entire structures that depend on stability and silence. Public perception began to divide into two clearly differentiated currents. On one hand, those who accepted the official version and considered that the case was being instrumentalized by rumors and unverified theories. For this group, the denials and communiques were sufficient to close the chapter. On the other hand, a growing number of people interpreted those same actions as signals of a broader defensive strategy designed to contain the damage before it expanded irreversibly. In the midst of this tension, questions arose that never obtained direct answers. Why did certain information appear briefly online and then disappear? Why were some details of the event's environment not addressed in the initial reports? What role did the prior relationships between the meeting's attendees play? Each question added a new layer of mistrust, reinforcing the idea that the public narrative was incomplete. The case of Yu Menglong ceased to be, at that point, an individual tragedy and transformed into an uncomfortable mirror of the industry's internal workings. The death of a young actor, with a career still in development, put in evidence the fragility of those who do not possess the same resources nor the same capacity for influence as other actors in the system. In contrast, figures with greater power seem to have mechanisms at their disposal to protect themselves from the impact, at least in the short term. This imbalance fueled social indignation. It was not just about demanding justice for a concrete person, but about questioning a model in which the truth can remain suspended when it conflicts with greater interests. The sensation that something did not fit became a collective feeling, difficult to silence, even in the face of official communiques and reassuring declarations. Do you believe that these contradictions are simple coincidences, or the reflection of a structure where power conditions the way facts are told? The discussion remains open, and every new piece of information, however small, continues to reignite a debate that is far from being resolved. Public attention reached a boiling point when the case ceased to be limited to communiques and denials, and began to show visible signs of impact in the real world. The silent withdrawal of a film from the main movie theaters was interpreted by many as a preventive reaction, a way to reduce exposure in the midst of an increasingly hostile social climate. For the public, that gesture did not represent neutrality, but an implicit confirmation that collective pressure was producing tangible effects. On digital platforms, the conversation acquired a markedly emotional tone. Thousands of users expressed their indignation, not only over the death of Yu Menglong, but over the sensation of inequality that emerged with force. While the life of a young actor seemed to have been reduced to a brief official note, figures with greater power continued issuing carefully constructed messages, protected by legal teams and by a network of influences difficult to trace. This perception fueled a dominant narrative, that of an industry where damage control is faster than the search for answers. In that context, unconfirmed information began to circulate regarding alleged payments destined to guarantee the silence of residents and indirect witnesses. The figures mentioned were difficult to assimilate, not because of their exactness, but because of the magnitude they suggested. There was talk of sums that, for the majority of people, represent a lifetime of work. Although these versions did not have official verification, their persistence in the public debate reflected a deeper problem: structural mistrust toward investigation mechanisms when they come into contact with large-scale economic interests. Some people claim to have received offers of economic compensation in exchange for not speaking to the media. Others described an atmosphere of subtle intimidation, marked by implicit warnings and by the sensation of being under constant observation. Regardless of the individual veracity of each testimony, the cumulative effect was devastating for the credibility of the official account. Instead of dispelling doubts, each new rumor reinforced the idea that there existed a coordinated effort to contain information and prevent the case from expanding beyond certain limits. The publication and subsequent deletion of sensitive documents intensified the climate of suspicion even more. For the public, these episodes did not seem like technical errors or coincidences. The speed with which certain content appeared and disappeared was interpreted as a demonstration of privileged access to resources normally inaccessible to the common citizenry. In an environment where transparency is fragile, these gestures were perceived as signals of power rather than attempts at clarification. Faced with this media avalanche, two clearly opposing stances took shape. One sector defended the need to respect official conclusions and warned about the danger of constructing narratives based on speculation. For this group, public pressure could lead to unfair parallel trials and irreparable damage to people who, until that moment, had not been formally accused. In contrast, another sector argued that recent history offered numerous examples of cases in which the truth only emerged thanks to social persistence and the refusal to accept incomplete versions. This clash of perspectives turned the case into a phenomenon that transcended the realm of entertainment. It transformed into a debate about the balance between institutional justice and citizen vigilance. When legal procedures advance slowly or seem to close prematurely, society looks for other channels to express its nonconformity. In this scenario, public opinion acts as a disorderly but constant force, capable of generating economic and symbolic consequences even in the absence of judicial resolutions. The figure of Tian Hairong continued to occupy a central place in this process. Each of her movements, each silence, and each declaration were analyzed with a magnifying glass. What in another context would have gone unnoticed, here acquired an amplified meaning. For many observers, her behavior reflected the tension between the need to protect an image built over years and the impossibility of completely controlling a narrative that had already escaped the private realm. The media avalanche did not offer definitive answers, but it did leave a clear trace. It showed how, in the digital era, perception can become a form of power. Collective pressure, although chaotic, is capable of altering business decisions, redefining reputations, and keeping alive a question that refuses to disappear. In the case of Yu Menglong, that question remains the same. If everything was an accident, why is it so difficult to accept silence as closure? To understand why the name of Tian Hairong became a constant reference point within this case, it is necessary to go back in time and observe the trajectory that took her from a relatively discreet position in the artistic sphere to the center of a web of economic and relational power. Her story is not one of a sudden ascent, but of a progressive accumulation of influence, built through strategic decisions, key alliances, and a precise understanding of how the balance of forces functions within the entertainment industry. In her early years, Tian Hairong was known mainly as an actress. She participated in productions that granted her moderate visibility, but not the status of an undisputed star. However, from the beginning, she showed a clear inclination toward creative control and business management. Instead of limiting herself to acting, she began to get involved in production and in the creation of her own structures, understanding that true stability in the sector does not always come from artistic recognition, but from the capacity to make decisions from behind the scenes. That focus was consolidated when she founded her own film company shortly after finishing her academic training. In a highly competitive environment, her strategy was based on diversifying risks, establishing lasting relationships, and avoiding dependence on a single project or ally. This model allowed her to remain active even in moments of uncertainty for the industry, strengthening a network that combined cultural and economic interests. The most significant turning point in her trajectory arrived with her relationship with Xu Ming, a businessman of enormous influence and resources. Their union not only represented a personal alliance, but also a direct link to a universe where capital, politics, and business intertwined in a complex manner. Through this relationship, Tian Hairong became linked to circles of power that far transcended the realm of entertainment, expanding her room for maneuver and her capacity for protection against external crises. However, the same framework that offered her backing also contained the seeds of a future fall. When high-level political figures associated with that circle began to lose their position, the balance broke. Zhu Ming was dragged into a legal process that culminated in his imprisonment, marking the beginning of a stage of uncertainty and reconfiguration. During that period, the public image of Tian Hairong was characterized by apparent discretion, centered on family life and a narrative of silent resistance. The death of Zhu Ming in prison, in circumstances that generated multiple interpretations, altered the landscape again. With his disappearance, a chapter closed, but another also opened. As his legal wife, Tian Hairong became associated with the inheritance of a considerable fortune, as well as with the memory of a system of power that had demonstrated its fragility. For many observers, this fact reinforced the perception that her current position could not be understood without considering the weight of that legacy. In this context, the suspicions that arose after the death of Yu Menglong acquired a different dimension. It was not solely about evaluating concrete actions, but about analyzing the structural capacity of influence that a figure like Tian Hairong could exercise. The question ceased to be whether or not there was direct implication, to transform into something broader. To what extent could a person with that history and those resources influence the way in which a crisis was managed? The notion of an empire built on complex relationships fed the public narrative of mistrust. Each silence was interpreted as calculation, each gesture as part of a greater strategy. In an environment where the past never completely disappears, previous connections became a lens through which every present event was analyzed. The figure of Tian Hairong thus went from being a film professional to a symbol of the gray zones where power, money, and control of information converge. This process revealed an uncomfortable reality for the industry. It showed how prestige and influence accumulated over the years can become a double-edged sword. That which protects in times of stability transforms into a focus of suspicion when a crisis breaks out. In the case of Yu Menglong, the personal history of Tian Hairong and her network of relationships did not offer definitive answers, but they did profoundly condition the way in which the public interpreted each new piece of data. At the end of this stage of the analysis, it remains clear that the debate does not revolve solely around an individual, but around a complete system. A system where rise and fall are usually determined by factors that transcend personal ethics, and where the consequences of past decisions resurface when least expected. In that sense, the figure of Tian Hairong represents something more than a proper name. She embodies the complexity of a power that, once exposed to the public light, can hardly operate in the shadows with the same impunity again. With the passage of time, the case of Yu Menglong has not found a clear closure in the legal realm. The official conclusions remain intact, and formal procedures have not offered new explanations that dispel the accumulated doubts. However, beyond the courts and institutional communiques, something has changed irreversibly. Public perception, once altered, hardly returns to its original state. At this point, the story ceases to belong solely to the files and comes to form part of the collective memory. For Tian Hairong, the consequences have not manifested in judicial sentences, but in a subtler and more persistent terrain. The loss of trust, constant scrutiny, and the fragility of an image built over decades have become a burden impossible to ignore. In the digital era, where every gesture is observed and every silence interpreted, prestige is no longer sustained solely with official declarations. Reputation is redefined day by day under the gaze of an audience that does not forget easily. This incomplete outcome poses a broader reflection on the nature of power in the world of entertainment. For years, the industry has functioned on the basis of informal balances, implicit agreements, and convenient silences. When everything proceeds with normality, these mechanisms remain hidden. But when a tragedy occurs, the fissures come to the surface. The case of Yu Menglong exposed that reality with crudeness, showing to what extent the truth can remain suspended between conflicting interests. The lesson that emerges is not limited to a proper name nor to a concrete episode. It speaks of the fragility of idols, of the distance between public image and internal dynamics, and of the responsibility that falls both on those who hold power and on those who observe it from the outside. Silence, when it is bought or imposed, does not eliminate questions, it only postpones them. And in that postponement, mistrust grows, eroding the credibility of the entire system. At the same time, this case demonstrates the strength of the collective conscience. Although disorderly and sometimes impulsive, the social reaction has managed to keep alive a conversation that otherwise could have diluted rapidly. The withdrawal of symbolic supports, public questioning, and the refusal to accept incomplete explanations are contemporary forms of pressure. They do not substitute for formal justice, but they act as a constant reminder that public opinion also has real weight. Looking toward the future, the question is no longer just if the complete truth about the death of Yu Menglong will come to light, but what impact this episode will leave on the industry as a whole. Each crisis of this type redefines the limits of the acceptable and forces a rethinking of the relationship between fame, power, and responsibility. Perhaps the greatest legacy of this story is not a definitive answer, but the warning that no system, however solid it seems, is immune to scrutiny when social conscience decides not to look the other way. The case remains open in the mind of the public, and as long as it remains so, it will continue to remind that justice does not always advance at the pace that is expected. But collective memory has a persistence that neither money nor power can completely erase.